Any other questions? I didn't mean to get going, but go ahead, Larry.
I like your idea of having the states spend the money, because the federal government, if they're handing money out, there's always strings attached and there's a lot of pork barrels. But if the states do it, is there a possibility that the states would spend too much into circulation?
I don't know how that's possible. Now, I hear that a lot. But if that, how many people have ever heard if you create another dollar, it makes the first one more worth less? If that's the case, how come these cars, they produce them and they're sitting around every place, they'll see in the lot, but they still keep the same price on them almost, don't they? Yeah. See, it never happens anyplace else, so why would it happen? But then, even, I wrote a new book back here, and we'll say there's demand for 100 books. I only printed 50 books. Well, would it hurt if I print the other 100 books to fill the demand? Would that make the price of my books go down? If the demand went up for 1,000 books, couldn't I print 1,000 books and just meet the demand? Can you tell me, do you know anybody that wouldn't like to have some more money? Does anybody here know anybody that you really believe would not like to have more money? Even Madoff seemed to think he had to have more money, and he was getting it pretty easily, I think. Well, if you have such a terrible demand, how could you possibly have too much of anything that had that much demand for it? And besides that, if you really did have too much money, can you have any savings until you have more money than you actually need to live on for that day or that week or month? How can you have a savings unless you have some surplus money? Now, I guarantee you I've got some savings. This is probably the only place. But could I get this unless I ate more than it took me to live that day? So that's what it really is. Any savings has to be a surplus. So if you have a surplus money, the people have more to save. And if they were just, they say, well, there's too much money to bid up the prices. I got one thing to sell and you three are going to bid on it. You may drive up the price, but what two of you is going to keep your money because there's none to buy? See, you just need to think these things through. Question what you've been told. I've learned to always question. In fact, my wife it just drives her nuts. And that takes a lot, because she's probably the strongest person I've ever met. And I'm serious. I'll sit there and watch the TV, and pretty quick I'll say, well, that's not true! And then I'll watch something else. Well, that can't be true! And see, this is what I have got from studying all this stuff. Because so many things, that's true. I had a meeting with some bankers and I asked them how money was created, and they said they did it through loans. They loaned the depositor's money. So I said, well, can you name me the depositor's money you loaned to somebody? Oh, no. Well, I said, okay, let's just assume that's true for a second. Where did the depositor get the money in the first place he deposited in the bank? The banker said, yeah, I don't know, I never thought about that. I suppose from the federal government, they create money. I said, that's strange. I wrote to the Treasury and they said they don't create any money that you do. Now, both things can't be true, so which one isn't? Either they lied to me or you're not telling me the truth. And then a friend of mine, he was talking to the Commerce Department down in Sten, and one of them said, well, we don't create any money, we only create credit. And that was a 100% true statement, except it had a wrinkle in it. Because credit's the only thing we use for money, so obviously they must create the money too, don't they? See, it's easy to use words to deceive, and when you think you're being informed. And you want to think about that. Any other questions? I either did an awful good job or an awful poor job, one or the other. Go ahead, you got one.
Yeah, go ahead. We're all based on the Federal Reserve. What do we have to, I mean, we saw what the optimal thing is that we need to do or start doing. How do we implement it? How do we get rid of the Fed? How do we...
Oh, I'm glad you asked, because getting rid of the Fed is a hard thing to do, and probably it's not the most pertinent thing you should do first. Because if you got rid of the Fed right now, you'd get rid of almost all the money, not all of it. Because what they don't tell you is, you always hear about the Fed, but nobody ever tells you that the state banks create money too. Now, the state itself cannot actually create any money under the United States Constitution. They give that right up to the federal government. It says right in there, Article 1, Section 10, no state shall coin money. And I have an article from Harvard University that at that time, back in the 1780s and in the 1700s, many times the word coin was used in the contents of coining paper money, coining leather money, coining land, coining words. It wasn't just coining metal money. So I don't think the states can actually create money, but the state banks do. And although they never tell us about that, the state banks are totally controlled by the state legislature. And I contacted the FDIC, which is the only federal agency that has anything to do with the state bank, and I asked him, is it true that banks can create money as investments the same way they created as loans? He said, absolutely. I said, then what would regulate what a bank might create money for what's investments? He said, that's a lot tougher question to answer. It might depend on whether a federal bank or a state bank or maybe even how big the state bank or how big the bank was. I said, well, now, just for now, let's just deal with the state banks. Oh, that's simpler. Anything the state legislature said, they'd have to do. I said, well, if the state passed a law that the banks would have to create money in a certain way to do a certain investment, would that be binding on FDIC audits? And he said, absolutely. That's what my subject matter experts told me to tell you. So there's your answer to your question. We can go down and have the state legislature create a law that the state banks will create the money, all the money we need, as a wealth, as a payment to rebuild our infrastructure. They won't need any taxes or interest or anything. And that bill's already in the state legislature. I didn't really start to get on that today, and I didn't think I brought much of the literature. But that's all we need to do is go down and work on your personal legislators and make sure they understand and support that bill, and we get it out of here. I've had 2 hearings on it, and as soon as I had the 2 hearings, the bankers got a lot more active, and I lost a little ground. But what we need to do is have people like yourselves contact your state legislators, and if you need, I'll come to the same meeting the first time or 2, and then after that you won't need any help. And they need to understand that they won't get back in office unless they start putting this kind of legislature into effect. And that's the easiest way to do it. I started out trying to do this on the federal level, and I found it's awful, awful hard to fund the trips to Washington, D.C. For first thing, I got to fly, or I got to drive for 2 days to get there. I got to stay in a hotel, and I got to eat meals all the time. And I did figure out how I could go. Before I left home, I would have a meeting every hour on the hour with one of the federal legislators. But by the time I could get back and get to them, they'd even forgot what the heck I said the first time. Didn't have a clue. I mean, this would be the in-between time, and I frankly do not have that kind of funds. Then one day, a guy called me and said, you got to listen to the Transportation Committee down at the state. They're on television. I did. And at least half of the senators in that meeting said, we've got to find a new and innovative way to fund transportation. And that made me start to think. And it took me, I've worked on it for 14 years now, and I've got it pretty down pat, but it took me several years. The first time, it took me almost 2 years to get anybody to understand what the heck I was trying to say. And I, of course, obviously, and everybody'd say, well, have you ever talked to so-and-so? And I'd go talk to all of them, and I've been down there as much as 5 days a week talking to these legislators, and now it's pretty clear. It's all laid out. Yeah, you can go on the website and look at it. It's House File 888, Senate File 705. And it's pretty plain and upright. Last year we had, not last session, not last year, we had a hearing both in the House and the Senate. But then after that, the bankers got really active, and it's been harder for me to gain ground down there. I've had as high as 15 sponsors on this bill. So it's possible, and here you can do it in a way that's much easier to do, because all of you can drive down to St. Paul pretty easy. I guarantee you it takes us quite a few bucks to go down to Washington, D.C. and spend a week down there. And if you do that every week, well, I mean, you're 2 days on the road and going down, 2 days coming back, or flying, which isn't cheap anymore either. And then I stayed in some pretty cheap hotels. One night it was raided there. I had a friend with me. He said, I slept through it all, and they were shooting, and they was raiding, and sirens going on. And he said, Byron, I couldn't sleep all night. I don't know how you just slept there and slept through the whole thing. But it didn't bother me. But so and if you stay in a really high-priced hotel, which is nice, but then your bill goes up, and I just couldn't afford it. And when I discovered this, I said, well, this is a better way to do it anyway, because now we can start out and we control it locally. Now we can start putting money into circulation where we place the money when we get rid of the Fed. Nature does not like to have a vacuum. And I guarantee you, you would not like to have a vacuum and any money flowing around in the system either. How many of you think could live 2 months without any income at all? Well, if they closed the Fed and didn't put anything to replace it, what would we use for money?